Remember the suspicious symmetry of division of Greek and Roman history into, in the case of Greece, 6 parts, 3 and 3, prehistory and history proper, and Rome, much trickier, where you have to ask yourself what perspective you're considering how to break Roman history down into when doing so. So, from the standpoint of the empire, you have pretty much the same suspiciously symmetrical arrangement into 3 and 3. But if you're considering from the standpoint of reality or truth, like what really happened, we need to reconsider what we talked about last time, which was the fact Livy and Virgil pretty much invented early Roman history. This fact is unbelievably not emphasized very much. It's another way of saying pretty much half of Roman history is purely invented by a quote historian, more a mythographer, really, when it comes to early Rome, and an epic poet who have that in common, using poetic license to create, not just embellish, the beginning of Rome. So now the transition from what we talked about last time into what we talk about today is to flesh it out, to flesh out what that vision is, okay? And I say vision carefully in the sense that it's more than facts. It's facts consistent with a vision, consistent with an overarching image that Augustus, through his money man Maecenas, and then again through Livy and Virgil, wanted to project to the Roman people for various reasons. The most pressing reason is so there's no revolution, so they don't get taken over by people who lack a history that glorifies the Roman people, but more particularly those who have had power throughout the ages. So Theseus, the Athenians, coming up with that myth in order to justify, in the eyes of the Athenians, the fact that Athens has become the new kid on the block, militarily, politically, etc., taking over for the prehistoric monarchies. Implicitly, Mycenae, although Mycenae is conspicuously missing from at least their iteration of that myth, but then also Minoan civilization, as represented by the first king and most iconic king, Minos himself, after which the civilization itself was named. The propagandistic aspects of creating, or at least perpetuating, the Theseus myth, and in particular those aspects of it that glorified Athens and at least indirectly showed how Minos went from being a good guy to a bad guy, to put it very simply. That's kind of what's going on here. The idea of creating a reality that is riffed off of by those in power and then accepted, internalized, justified by those under those in power. So let's go quickly through what each of those writers who were appointed by Augustus indirectly through Maecenas hired Livy and Virgil to propagandize early Rome. So how did they do it? The poet, Virgil, talked about the first ancestor of the Romans, Aeneas. Aeneas was not a Greek, but rather a Trojan. In other words, the archenemy of the Greeks. So how do you justify, as Romans at the beginning of the empire, not only associating yourself with the Trojans, but pretty much saying we are Trojans, because they are the descendants of Aeneas, the hero of the eponymous epic by Virgil. The idea is that the Romans who are reading the Aeneid, and now we're talking about written literature as opposed to Homeric first, they are meant to think of themselves as the descendants of Aeneas, so therefore the descendants of the enemies of Greece. So you keep that idea in mind and not lose it. Let me just throw out real fast the significance of that instead of milking it, okay, because we can go on and on about it. But the idea is simply this. The Romans, among other peoples, conquered the Greeks, militarily, at some point in the earlier period of their history, of their real history. And this is a way for the Romans to say we're the new kids on the block, and we have supplanted the Greeks in the same way that the Athenians used Theseus as a symbol of overtaking Minos in Minoan civilization, and by extension overtaking Greek prehistory and saying we're into the historical epic now. Aeneas in the Iliad was a hero, a full-fledged hero, yes. It's good enough just to mention he has some divine blood in him. So he's a hero in the same sense that Achilles is, for example. But he didn't really distinguish himself that much in the Aeneid. He got a little help from the gods here and there. He was by no means even close to Achilles' caliber, or even Ajax or Odysseus' caliber as a hero, intrinsically speaking. So it was a good idea for Virgil to choose Aeneas rather than a more conspicuous Trojan, such as Hector, although Hector died, so that wouldn't do any good, but you get my point. Someone more along the lines of Hector to serve as the first ancestor of the Roman people, if for no other reason than to allow themselves, the Romans, and in particular Virgil the poet, to do whatever he wants. Think of it as a model on a runway and being able to clothe him or her any way you want to. Even though the person is probably extremely attractive physically, nevertheless, not so out there and already well defined by a previous, in this case, fashion designer, so that you associate that person with only one way of wearing clothes. So the idea is that to some extent a model is supposed to be able to literally be that, model of different kinds of clothes, etc. Well, Aeneas, in a sense, is a model for a hero who could be shaped any way Virgil wanted to shape him. And therein lies a connection at the end of Greek history, the Alexandrian library, Apollonius Rhodius and Callimachus being poets, or at least thinking of themselves as such, to be poets in their own right. And the most conspicuous way they differentiated themselves from the poets who came before them was to really simplify things, to create poetry that was unabashedly, unapologetically difficult, that needed a real intellectual training and rigor in order to be able to appreciate satisfactorily. The Romans saw the Alexandrian poets as their artistic models, rather than the Greeks who the Alexandrian librarians were appointed to preserve the works of. So what does that mean? It means that the way that Aeneas, the protagonist of the eponymous epic, the Aeneid, is drawn, portrayed, much differently than pretty much any other hero except for one, Jason. Many credible literary critics will associate Aeneas with Jason for several reasons. First of all, Virgil's poetry is, although not necessarily as difficult to understand as some of the Alexandrian poetry, still very self-consciously what they call in literary theory conceited. Conceited has to do with self-consciously clever or self-consciously intellectually impressive in the art that you make. So there's no denying that Virgil is extremely that in the Aeneid, in the same way the Alexandrian poets. So that's one aspect of it. Another thing is the idea of the imagery being a lot more realistic, consistent with the development of sculpture over time becoming more realistic. So yeah, Virgil's Aeneas, as well as other characters within his epic, are very emotional. They'll engage in emotional outbursts in a way that we might deem to be unheroic if we are using only a Greek standard to judge that by. But it becomes heroic in the very fact that now you're dealing with an epic that deals with a legitimate hero, and now all of a sudden you see a guy like Aeneas, the founder of the Roman people, in one of the books of the Aeneid, closer to Odysseus at the end of the Odyssey with Penelope, kind of this romantic side of this guy. So he's in some ways more of a romantic than we would be used to, except maybe with Odysseus, in connection with being a hero. But then it even goes further than that, and one aspect of Aeneas that the classicists like to point out a lot is that he's not only unlike heroes that came before him, other than maybe Jason when it comes to what I just said, but also in the sense that when it comes to his mettle, M-E-T-T-L-E, his inner strength, he's considered to be a relatively wimpy hero. He's relatively wimpy in the sense that he exhibits all too human traits, such as complaining about things. Sometimes he shows a more heroic side to himself. In a real famous scene, he'll stand above everyone else and be very, what would eventually be considered stoical. But other times, just not as much. And so what does that mean? The takeaway from that, when considered in relation to the idea of him being the first ancestor of the Romans, is even though he has some divine blood, he's someone he's relatable. He's a worthy first ancestor of, from the standpoint of the Romans, our people. And that we might want to connect with Dionysus, the idea of Dionysus or Demeter, being Olympians who tended to be more relatable. The bottom line is that in the Aeneid, you have Aeneas as a kind of, in some ways, half Achilles and half Odysseus, in the sense that half of the Aeneid is based unabashedly and unequivocally on the Iliad, and half is based on the Odyssey. But in the same way that the Greeks would sometimes carry something over from the past and then mess around with it, such as the hero Theseus being a guy with 6 labors instead of 12, for example, kind of heavy-handed message that even though this guy is based on that guy, he's not nearly as great as him. He's half as good. Virgil is kind of self-effacingly, as an artist, saying, okay, I'm basing my work on Homer, but don't worry, guys. In the same way the Athenians in the classical period would say to the rest of Greece, don't worry, guys, we still worship Heracles because he's the greatest hero, not only for all you non-Athenians, but us Athenians as well, even though we have our indigenous hero, Theseus. So we're talking about a situation here where Virgil says, yeah, I'm basing the Aeneid on Homer, but by the same token, I am not pretending to be anything like what Homer is when it comes to artistry, or there's no comparing me with him, so don't worry. It's a tricky line to negotiate, and he does it successfully to the extent to where in our times at least, there are those who say that Virgil in several ways is far better than Homer, okay, when it comes to, for example, the kind of self-conscious artistry that we're talking about. Embedding, supposedly at least, embedding word games within the Aeneid. There are those who have theories that there's a lot more to the Aeneid than meets the eye, okay? You don't get that many people saying that about Homer. It's oral poetry, it's more organic, it's more of a, kind of like what I'm doing right now, just talking to you, okay? That it is, but using material from the past, phrases, etc., but more of a communication in real time. Whereas Virgil wrote something, and in the writing it down, took painstaking care in arranging words on the line in very effective, artistically effective ways. And it's aspects of his art that maybe, unfortunately, depending on whether or not you ever take Latin, is unavailable to you unless you use a lot of paraphrase. It's really hard to do unless there's some component of actually learning his language, because that's his music. It's like trying to explain jazz music through classical notation. So we can only go so far with that. But the bottom line is that the Aeneid is based on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, although reversed. And that's the punchline here, is that his way of saying to the Romans, don't worry, I'm not pretending to be anything like what Homer is to put, well, at least one of them, is to put the Odyssey-inspired elements first, in the first 6 books of the epic, and to put the Iliad-inspired things in the second 6 books. And you'll remember that the Iliad comes before the Odyssey. So he's reversing the order, and there are 12 books to the Aeneid, exactly half as many as either of Homer's epics. And 12, remember, is the magic number of the 12 labors of Heracles, and Theseus has 6 labors, exactly half as many as that. So we're doing half of 24, which is 12, and then you got the 6, which is half of the 12. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. All right? But that's an effective way, and at least it's been read to be so by Virgil, to make it clear that I ain't no Homer, don't worry, I'm not pretending to be, but I'm inspired by Homer. Why choose Homer? Because Homer is the shizzle. Homer is it. Not only in Greece, but also in Rome. It's not only a matter of Aeschylus saying that everything we tragedians do is from the banquet of Homer. It's a matter of the Romans using Homer as the most potent symbol of how the military victors over the Greeks were really the cultural victims of the Greeks. Juno is the champion of Aeneas. Now, who's Juno? Hera, kind of. Yeah, let's throw that out. Whenever I say someone is someone, it's not true. Okay, that's a misnomer. You look at, who is the Roman Athena? Minerva, right? Wrong. Minerva's Minerva, right? Who is the Roman Ares? Mars, right? Way wrong. Who is the Roman Aphrodite? Venus, right? Way wrong. Vesta, all right? Hestia was one of the original, what was going to be, Olympians. And then she eventually got kicked out and to make room for Dionysus. She got zero respect, so much that she had to not even be an Olympian anymore. She started out being a sibling of the original Olympians, and then eventually she's ousted. Barely ever is she depicted in Greek art. Barely ever does she take part in stories. And her name itself means fireplace. So good luck, right? Dionysus, god of wine. How are you going to compete with that, right? So she's, walking around, she represents the fireplace. Ha, ha, ha. Now, okay, that's funny. Get a good laugh. Then when you get to Rome, oh boy, the word fireplace or hearth is said in a much more serious way, because what that represents is the centerpiece of a household within the context of a society where religion has moved, as far as real worship goes, from the temple to the household. So then all of a sudden, Vesta, who is the kind of Roman Hestia, the one I just described, she becomes one of the most important of the Olympians, mentioned in the same breath as Jupiter, kind of the Roman equivalent to Zeus. So things change. But the most fun difference is Mars and Ares. That really gets cool, because Mars gets a lot of respect from the Romans in a way that Ares is just this horrible laughingstock. Take a look at Book 5 of the Iliad. Take a look at him going up to Zeus after being hurt on the battlefield by Diomedes, who is inspired by Athena to go on a rampage on the battlefield, and he goes up, he's wounded by Diomedes, and he says to Zeus, hey, I'm really hurt, help me, Daddy. And he says, screw you, I can't stand you, nobody likes you, get the hell out of here. And it's a straightforward, I hate you, Ares. I mean, it's like, poor guy, he's in this horrible pain, because gods can feel pain, they just can't die. So he's in horrible pain from the battlefield, and Zeus just says, get the hell out of here, I can't stand you, nobody likes you. There wasn't anything he did in that particular context that caused him to say that, other than in general, nobody likes you. You don't get that with Mars. So it's Juno who is kind of the Roman Hera. Now that's a big deal. all right? Because Hera don't get much respect from the Greeks. Juno gets mucho respect from the Romans. So this is a good example of how different the Greek gods are from the Roman gods. Juno is the champion of Aeneas, who is a multiple choice, A, Greek, B, Roman, C, Trojan. He's a Trojan. So, hey, whoa, hang on now. So let's put two and two together. We're talking about Virgil being hired by Augustus through Maecenas, the money man, his best friend, to be the guy who writes the official epic of Rome. And the protagonist of the official epic of Rome, the first ancestor of the Romans, is a Trojan. A guy from Troy, a guy who fought in the Trojan War around 1250 BC or so, 500 years before Homer, who is about 725 years before Augustus. Interesting. So it's a little more time, but you have a little bit of symmetry there, right? And so why is it that the Romans, and another way to put that is Augustus, has Virgil invent their first ancestor as being not a Greek within the context of a society where the Romans admit freely that they are not only borrowing but stealing from the Greeks culturally. Okay, so there's this famous saying by the Romans, not by the Greeks, the victors become the victims. The idea being that the Romans who conquer militarily end up being the victims when it comes to art, culture, all that kind of stuff. So there's almost like an idea of a trade-off between Rome and Greece when it comes to that. So if that's the case, if there's so much consensual respect given to the Greeks when it comes to them as precursors, to the extent to where there's very little attempt, for example, to invent new literary genres. Okay, like the Romans invented satire. Some argue they invented the novel, which is kind of wrong, not true. Now, practical science, when you talk about building and engineering, whatever, all bets are off. The Romans kicked the crap out of the Greeks. It begins with the late Greeks, though. Guys like Archimedes in the Hellenistic period. So the Romans depended on them as well. But when you're talking about poetry and epic and tragedy and all that stuff, the Romans just pretty much said, we love our precursors in this genre, and we're going to do the best we can within the parameters of that genre. If that's the case, then isn't there a seeming disconnect between the Romans coming up with their first ancestor and it not being a Greek? Why is a Trojan considered to be the first ancestor of the Romans? There's a historical, if not reason, then something that makes it make a lot of sense. So there's overlap in religion and mythology between the Greeks and the Trojans, absolutely. So Apollo took the side of the Trojans in the Trojan War. So you got that kind of to where it's not they're not completely foreign to each other in that respect. Yeah, but historically, shortly before Augustus becomes the first emperor, the Romans, like everyone else in the known world, conquered the Greeks and didn't kill the men and put the women into slavery like they did with a lot of places, but they conquered them militarily and allowed them to go on culturally the way they always had, but made it clear that now the Romans are in charge. There was a military victory called Pydna, P-Y-D-N-A, a battle that is brought up in history books, and it represents the Romans eventually defeating the Greeks. And so here you have a historical justification for considering your first ancestor to be the opposite of the people that you just conquered. But gods were shared between the Greeks and the Trojans, because what that does is set the stage for it not being weird. Think about France and Germany have been, if not overtly throughout the ages, there's a total culture battle between them. If you go to either country, they're not the best friends in the world, okay? There's historical reasons, etc. So for a French hero to become the king of Germany would be much weirder than what happened, say, between France and England when you're talking about William the Conqueror and all that. So it wasn't a weird thing because of the shared religion. So that's the background to how it was that the first ancestor of the Romans was a Trojan. But there's more to it, okay? So what are you doing? What is Virgil doing? He's looking back. And when I say he, I mean sanctioned by Augustus. I mean Augustus, really. Okay, let's get real here. So Virgil/Augustus, but I'll keep saying Virgil. Virgil looks back as far as he can to what is considered by the Romans to represent the apex of Greek culture. And that, all the way from the archaic period that Homer himself lived in, was the Homeric epics. That was considered to be the pinnacle of Greek culture, and still is. Modern poets like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot mention Homer in the same breath as Shakespeare, and there's no other. Sappho, interestingly, is the other poet that is sometimes mentioned in the same breath, even though we only have a few of her poems left. So you have Virgil looking back not only at the fact that the first ancestor of the Romans is going to be a Trojan, but you have other ways in which Virgil creates associations in the mind of the reader of the Aeneid with ancient Greece. So it goes beyond characters, it goes beyond the fact that Aeneas is a Trojan from the Trojan War, so it goes beyond plot and character, and it extends also to the structure of the epic itself. So very interesting correspondences between the Aeneid and Homer. Not a coincidence at all. Very straightforward, very significant in the sense that you can randomly choose examples of correspondence on a passage-by-passage level between Homer and Virgil. For example, Book 4, there's a part where there's a simile, which means just as something is whatever, so something is whatever. We're talking about Aeneas, and it says, he seemed, and then there's a hyphen, think of the Lord Apollo in the spring, blah, 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 and it goes on. And then it ends with, so elated and swift, Aeneas walked with sunlit grace upon him. All right. This is an example, relatively trivial, but for that reason, in my eyes, very significant, because there are so many of these little so-called trivial things, that Virgil knew that the reader of his epics would make the connection with Homer. And here's an example. When you call Aeneas swift, right away, the Roman reader knows that you are at least indirectly comparing him to Achilles, because swift-footed was the nickname, the epithet, given by Homer consistently throughout the Iliad to Achilles. Okay, the only other character who had the epithet with swift in it was Iris, kind of the second-in-command messenger from Olympus, a female Hermes, if you will. And so what do you have here? You have this idea of, oh, wait a minute, think of the Lord Apollo, so elated and swift. So here you're comparing Aeneas not to Achilles, not saying, hey, he's just as good as Achilles or whatever, the way you would, say, compare Theseus to Heracles, and quite often was done, but rather here we're going one step up. We're taking it to the next level, and we are comparing Aeneas, in this case, to Apollo. And we are switching the epithet from Achilles, a mere hero, compared to gods, to a god, to Apollo. And that's kind of a very subtle, see what I mean? It's a very, very subtle, you could miss it if you blink, but one of so many of those types of references to Homer, but beyond references. It's not strictly, usually isn't only an homage to Homer. It's appropriating Homer for your own purposes by starting with a base. Talking and cooking, I don't cook, but I just know that they talk this way on those shows, right? You have a base, right, of something, whatever. So the base is Homer. But then from there, you grow, okay? And how do you grow? What you do is quite often you compare, for example, Aeneas with, in this case, Achilles, or with more often Odysseus. You take that basis, and then you go further with it. And you show how Aeneas improves on the models rather than merely emulates them. Now, the best example of that is in the field, in the realm of morality. This is what Augustus put Vergil up to and Livy up to more than anything else, was to illustrate the moral superiority of the Romans, not only of their current enemies in the world, especially the Carthaginians, but also the ancient Greeks. So you have this weird paradox where your collective fanboys, fan people of the Greeks, while at the same time doing the best you can to portray the hero based on a Greek hero as better than that Greek hero. And it's successful because the playing field on which that's done is a playing field that is barely, if at all, broached by the Greeks themselves, by Homer himself. In Homer, you have nothing but Zeus running around having sex with whoever he wants, and this is the one you're supposed to worship with a serious face. It goes on all the time. Not as much of that in the Aeneid. Okay, the Aeneid is a much more morally preoccupied epic. Why? Now is when we tie in history. We need to remember that what's going on in the background is, above all else, and I hope you never forget this, you guys, take this from the class even, all this stuff that's going on, the biggest priority in the backdrop of all of this is Augustus trying not to get assassinated. It sounds simplistic, but it's true. You're trying to create some would call illusion, others would call the warranted image, because some would argue that it's matched by reality, of Augustus being that much more worthy of not being killed by senators than Caesar was, who was justifiably killed by senators, according to those who believe that Augustus succeeded in not making the same mistakes that Caesar did. There are lots of references about how Aeneas, and this is also in Livy, by the way, in a big way, about how the Romans are careful, in the case of Livy, Romulus, the first king, and in the case of Virgil, Aeneas, the first ancestor of the Romans, very careful, once you're in power, not to upset the cart with the Senate. The Senate has all the power. The Senate has the power to make or break the individuals with the armies behind them, because they're only individuals and they only have one neck. It doesn't matter how many people you have behind you. Caesar, his big mistake was believing that he had an iron neck. Why? Because he had all the troops behind him almost. He had so many more troops behind him than anyone else. So then what happens? In 44 BC, he's assassinated, and then comes along his adoptive son, takes the reins after he gets into a battle with Mark Antony, and then Cleopatra and all that stuff, and takes the reins from Julius Caesar and gets behind him all the troops and more, because now he has official sanction by the Senate. So now he has all the troops that were against Caesar and all the troops that were with Caesar all behind him. But he's smart enough to know the way Caesar wasn't, and you can't blame Caesar, because who did he have to learn from other than himself? And it was too late. Augustus learned from Caesar not to misinterpret having all the troops in the universe behind you, equating that with being immune to the power of the Senate. Money is the same thing, and fame. I'm thinking of Kurt Cobain. When it happened, it was like, whoa. First thing was like, but then it was like, whoa, the guy had like $500 million, all the fame in the world, plus blah, 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 and still this happens. You have all the power in the world as a general, but it's tough if that's all you have. You also have to have the Senate in your pocket. It's all about individuals assigned to provinces with troops behind them and having to continue pleasing the Senate or they get killed. And so Augustus knew exactly what they knew about what he had to do, and he did it.